Today we're talking Thinner by Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King. It's kind of hard to talk about this book without getting a little bit into the Richard Bachman pseudonym and what Stephen King was attempting to do with it. The story goes that King's publisher at the time, Signet, was wary of letting authors publish more than one book per year, but King's notoriously extensive and quick output was making that a sort of difficult arrangement. A couple extra books began to pile up, and Stephen King, who at this point was already a pretty massive commercial success, I guess kind of got curious how much of that success was due to luck and how much of it was due to skill. So with these things in mind, he convinced Signet to let him publish some other books under the Richard Bachman pseudonym. I'm not sure if Stephen King ended up coming to any conclusions regarding his whole luck versus skill debate thing he was doing, but to be honest, it wasn't a very experimentally sound test in the first place, because the content of the Richard Bachman books to me is pretty noticeably distinct from the other Stephen King books that he was releasing at the time. Before Thinner, there was Rage, The Long Walk, Road Work, The Running Man, and all four of those books I would say are kind of characteristically different from other Stephen King books that were being released in the 70s and 80s. They're bleaker, they have darker endings, the protagonists are kind of worse people, and King just seems to take on a more pessimistic attitude in general with them. Thinner is the fifth Bachman book, and it was the last one to be released before his identity was revealed. He did go on to write two more Bachman books after this, The Regulators and Blaze, but to me those don't have the ethos of a true Bachman book, because the jig was kind of already up at that point. The alternate name was more or less just a shtick when he was releasing those books. I think Thinner is the best Bachman book, both in terms of its representation of what makes a Bachman book, but I also just think it's the most interesting and the best written of the group. It's about a lawyer named Billy Halleck who carelessly runs over this Romani woman with his car and is left off without any punishment because of his legal connections. And as a result, Billy is cursed by this woman's father, who gently touches his cheek and utters the word thinner, which causes him to uncontrollably start losing weight. It's a pretty simple premise, but with it, King is able to dive pretty deep into these themes of like revenge and justice and consequence, all while maintaining this pretty horrific story about this man who is falling further and further into complete emaciation. It's a great Bachman premise, fronted by perhaps the most complete Bachman protagonist of them all. Billy Halleck, like a lot of Bachman protagonists, is not necessarily evil, but he's just kind of an asshole, and throughout the entire book he just refuses to take any responsibility for his actions the entire time. The whole reason he hit the woman in the car in the first place is because his wife Heidi was jerking him off while they were driving, so he got distracted. He constantly blames Heidi throughout the book, growing more and more resentful of her good health as his body deteriorates, to the point that at the end of the story, he basically regards her with like a complete vitriolic hatred. He also blames the Romani woman herself, constantly alluding to the fact that she was jaywalking and she wasn't paying attention to her surroundings. And this very lack of accountability is why he gets cursed in the first place, and this is where King gets really deep into themes of justice and revenge. The Romani people are a marginalized ethnic group who have been historically mistreated, and I think their resorting to a supernatural curse in this book is kind of supposed to be a metaphor for their powerlessness and their seeking of justice that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get through normal channels. Honestly, I think for a book written in the 80s, Stephen King handles the racial component about as tactfully as you could ask for. He still writes the Romani people in a pretty stereotypical way, and he refers to them by the pejorative term that has fallen out of favor in recent years, but he is obviously empathetic to their plight, and even though they are seen as the villains of the story, their point of view is still always explained, and it always makes logical sense, and it's always examined up against Billy, who himself is not a very morally pure character either. Tadeusz Lemke is the man who personally curses Billy, and he's one of the most fascinating King villains I've come across. He's over 100 years old, his nose has completely rotted off, and he has access to a whole host of supernatural curses. Billy Halleck got the thinner curse, obviously, but the judge, for example, who let Billy off, started growing alligator scales all over his body, and then the cop who drove them off the land they were staying on got covered with such severe acne that he killed himself. He's kind of the inverse of Billy, whereas Billy is not purely evil. Teddy's Lemka is not purely benevolent. He's a supremely powerful figure. He's stubborn and mean and borderline vicious a lot of the time, but he's also the leader of his community. He is an intelligible and understandable figure who just wants to ultimately protect his people and protect his family. This book also contains one of my favorite side characters, Richard Janelli, who is a former client of the law firm that Billy works at, and he's basically just a caricature of a mob/mafia type guy. He is hell-bent on getting the curse taken off Billy because on one hand, Billy is ostensibly his friend, but mainly it's just because he's crazy and bloodthirsty, and with his background in organized crime, he just kind of enjoys this sort of thing. And yeah, the entire last act of this book, more or less, is Richard Janelli scouting and infiltrating the Romani camp and basically blackmailing and threatening them with extreme violence to take off the curse. I just found him to be such an entertaining character that I was kind of rooting for him, even though his justifications are pretty much just completely wrong. And finally, I want to talk about the ending, which I think is perfectly grim for the story that precedes it. Taddus basically finally agrees to take the curse off Billy on the condition that he has to pass it on to somebody else personally. Apparently, cosmic justice doesn't care about who pays for what, who's guilty of what or why, just somebody has to pay, basically. Taddus presents Billy with this strawberry pie, which Billy has to put some of his own blood in, his literal blood in to do this ritual. The curse is transferred into the pie, and then Billy has a limited amount of time to get somebody else to eat the pie to transfer the curse into them. Billy, who still hasn't learned to take any responsibility, intends to feed this pie to his wife, who he still has deep feelings of unjustified hatred towards. Unfortunately, the pie ends up getting eaten by both Billy's wife and his innocent daughter as well, while Billy was sleeping. And so when he realizes this, when he wakes up, he is racked with such guilt and turmoil that he takes another slice for himself, annihilating him and his entire family in the process. It's a very dismal and morbid ending to the story, but I kind of love how just merciless it is. Sometimes King has this tendency to, try to see the good in his characters, to draw a silver lining, to, sort of give a light at the end of the tunnel. But in Thinner, his conviction is clear. You can't escape the consequences of your own actions, and attempting to do so will lead to your ultimate demise. I really like this book. I think it's pretty underrated. I'm going to give it 8 curses out of 10.